Suzanne Schulte is chairman of the North Korea Freedom Coalition. She thinks Kim cannot be trusted.
I just feel that the regime is using the same playbook as Kim Jong-un's father. They're just going to try to manipulate our good intentions. Now, on our side, I do believe when you have a team like John Bolton and Pompeo, we have two people that know this regime. We have a president that has a team that will not be fooled, and he's also shown how much he cares about the people of North Korea.
And Schulte says there's only one acceptable outcome.
My hope is that we're going to see the end of this regime, because that's the only way you're going to have peace on the Korean Peninsula, is when the Kim regime is gone.
I'm Chad Groening.
There are more evacuations across Colorado where wildfires are raging.
The 416 wildfire in southwestern Colorado near Durango has burned for almost 2 weeks, growing to almost 24,000 acres. Fueled by dry conditions and winds, firefighters also dealing with dangerous terrain.
A lot of potential to get folks hurt in there, so we're trying to minimize the exposure to firefighters.
The 416 fire only 15% contained. Meantime, some 2,500 homes also evacuated near the town of Silverthorne in north central Colorado, where one of several other wildfires is growing and where fire officials expect 25-mile-an-hour wind gusts there today. Jeff Manasso, Fox News.
One house of Congress apparently needs a huge nudge from the public to protect victims of trafficking.
The Trafficking Victims Protection Act expired in 2017, a law that was victim-focused. It provided funds to deal with the problem internationally and in this country. That, according to Nita Bells of In Our Backyard.
It reauthorizes $520 million in federal funding over 4 years to prevent human trafficking, protect victims, prosecute traffickers around the world. It would also prevent U.S. taxpayer funds from landing in the hands of international traffickers.
It would give the State Department an extra tool for dealing with countries that are working on trafficking but not doing enough. Bell says it's important to understand many of the victims are children, including in this country.
The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children determined that of the cases of runaway youth in 2016 alone, 1 of 6 of those kids are likely victims of sex trafficking, children suffering repeated rape and other forms of severe violence.
The problem is that the House has passed a bill reauthorizing funding, but the Senate has not acted, and non-government organizations are hampered in providing assistance to the victims. In Our Backyard is calling on Americans to contact the 2 senators to light a fire to move on the legislation. The measure is one of several hundred held up in the Senate. I'm Charlie Butt.
For American Family News, I'm Rusty Pugh.
I'm Will Addison, Director of Urban Family Talk. We desire to be a movement of time tellers. In 1 Chronicles 12:32 it says, the sons of Issachar were men who had understanding of the time, to know what Israel ought to do. In these perilous times, God is raising up a people of discernment who will see, pray, and act. We sound the alarm as watchmen. We cry aloud that God's people may be activated for his service. Join the movement at urbanfamilytalk.com.
Welcome to Stacy on the Right with your host, Stacy Washington.
But I just think it shows you that Donald Trump really hasn't changed in 20 years. What he believed then, he believes now, and he's not gonna change his mind. So when he says he's been preparing for this his entire life, I mean, it may be partially true, even though he didn't expect to be president of the United States at that particular point, which may be why he says he didn't need to prep.
Right, and what certainly hasn't changed is his own self-regard, Trump's regard for himself as this incredible negotiator, this very adept businessman. He's thought of himself in that way for many, many years. And certainly his ego is no smaller today than it was 2 decades ago.
There's no situation in which he wouldn't say he was perfectly prepared all his life, no matter what. Negotiations.
His self-confidence clearly has not changed either.
Are we really going to know what occurred in this meeting? Back to your earlier point, which Sam was talking about. I mean, these 2 men, neither one is known for their veracity. Let me put it that way. So you have Donald Trump and you have Kim Jong-un coming out of this meeting. They may very well be telling different stories. We then know that Pompeo will be meeting and has been meeting. So are we going to have to wait to hear from the Secretary of State? But he wasn't there. So for history's sake, we really have no record of this historic meeting.
Wow. So welcome to Stacey on the Right here on Urban Family Talk and American Family Radio. Wowza, wowza, wowza. I'm always a little teensy bit surprised when I hear people making all these statements about the way other people think about themselves. Now, obviously, we can ascertain a ton on people's behaviors. We can observe them, but you can never truly know the inside of a person, what they're thinking about themselves, unless they tell you, and you can trust that they're being completely candid with you because they know you and they trust you. What I know is that most of the time for me, whatever you see on the outside is actually probably the opposite of what's going on the inside. When people think I'm the most confident and I'm doing the most fantastic, I don't feel like it's going well at all. I do think the president has an extraordinary level of confidence in his abilities, but that comes with age and experience. And when I hear people denigrating men in leadership for their self-confidence, what I really hear as an undertone of that is that they don't understand masculinity. And that's kind of a crisis in our country right now, the misunderstanding of masculinity, the attempt to demonize it and label it as toxic, to characterize men in ways that are negative because they're men and they're exercising and operating within their gifts and talents in the way that God made them. And so it's just interesting. So anyway, that's a good little foray into the beginning of the show. Welcome into Stacey on the Right here on American Family Radio and Urban Family Talk. We are so glad to be with you today. We have just another really fantastic lineup for you. That was CNN's Gloria Borger to Wolf Blitzer, and they were on a panel, and they were talking about this interview that happened 19 years ago with Donald Trump, then a private citizen, and he was being interviewed on CNN by Wolf Blitzer, who, oddly enough, is also the person that Gloria Borger was speaking with, Wolf Blitzer, so almost 20 years ago. And he was saying a lot of the same things that he's saying now, which means that these aren't new ideas for him, which is infuriating to liberals because they want to paint the president as being unprepared. We're going to listen to the president's audio of him talking in an interview about losing $500 billion to China in trade. And when we listen to that, I'd like you to listen for an emotional quality to the way he's describing the amount of money that America is losing, and picture that same type of fervor for someone protecting something that it belongs to them and they're really invested in. And because I think if we could just step back for a second, and whatever it is that we don't like about President Trump, take a moment to understand where he's coming from and that he's actually losing money being the president. He's losing not just stature and reputation, but actual wealth he's losing by being president of the United States. Then you have to kind of think, well, what is driving him to do this job? Why wouldn't he just look at his balance sheet for year over year and say, I've lost nearly $1 billion in wealth, or just over $1 billion in wealth. This isn't a winning proposition for me. If I keep going in this way, I'll be less than a billionaire at the end of my presidency. What's the motivator for me to continue to do this? I already own mansions. I already own private planes, helicopters, jets. I already own all the stuff. I already have teams of security. I already have, thousands of employees across the country. I don't actually need this to stroke my ego or to give me stature. So why would I continue to do this job? If you look at it from that perspective, most presidents come into the Oval Office with a certain level of wealth. Bill Clinton had a wealth of $500,000. He left, and he's left multimillionaire. He's now worth $240 some odd million. Barack Obama came in. He was worth about $3 million. He's now worth $41 million and climbing. And President Trump came in. He was $4.5 billion, I believe that was the last count just before he started the campaign. Now he's worth just a hair over $3 billion. So he's in the losing proposition. So we're also going to have two great interviews today. Deigo Echeverri is a director of coalitions for Concerned Veterans for America, And I'm so excited about speaking with Deigo about what the Mission Act actually does and getting some information on that. As a veteran, fourth generation veteran, married to a veteran and many other veterans in our family, I really want to have as something that we're doing on the show more often, highlighting what we can do to help veterans reacclimate themselves back into the private sector, and also programs that either help or hinder their progress in doing so. We have a debt that we owe to people that go over and leave their limbs in the sand, in the Middle East or in Bosnia and Herzegovina and all of the different conflicts that we've been involved in. And I don't think America does a good job of taking care of people once they get back home. For people like me, who I wasn't injured on active duty, and I was pretty healthy leaving out when I did my exit interview and my exit medical assessment, I was healthy. But for a lot of veterans, they're not. So we're going to talk to Deigo about that. And then in hour 2, we're talking about racism and white supremacy and what it is and what it isn't. We're going to interview Arno Michaelis. He's a former white supremacist and the co-author of The Gift of Our Wounds. Notice I said former. So he's going to come on here and I'm going to get to ask him whatever I want about him. He was a white supremacist, someone who believed in the superiority of the white race at the expense of others. So we're going to talk to him. We're going to dip in and out of Jim Acosta's horrible behavior at the summit. He was overseas. He had an opportunity to represent CNN well. He did not. And others as well. We're going and we'll take your calls as well. 866-963-2037. StaceyOnTheRight.com is the website where you can subscribe. And thanks for being here today. And everyone from all over, and then especially the listeners who are on terrestrial radio. Thanks for being here. So now we have President Trump, and he's talking about losing $500 billion to China on trade. And remember, we're listening for the motive for someone who is already a multi-billionaire and extraordinarily successful, has grandkids, has one young child at home still, is wealthy and can make the decision to live however he wants, wherever he wants, doing, whatever. He's the options for him are limitless. He chooses instead to lose his stature and his reputation to run for the president of the United States. And while this makes him much more powerful than he was in the private sector, it comes along with attendant circumstances that are not beneficial to a person who's used to moving freely about the country unimpeded, as well as his wife and extended family. So they've all suffered in the proposition. Why would he do it? It's number 2.
No, I felt very good at the beginning. And I talked about we have to denuke. This country has to be denuked. And he understood that. He fully understood it. He didn't fight it. And we're doing some great things, and for his country, and South Korea is going to be involved very much in helping, and Japan is going to be involved, and President Xi of China has been, really terrific on the border. I think less so the last couple of months, unfortunately.
Was that a big part? Because your meetings, when you met with the president of China, was scheduled, if I recall, for like 15 minutes. Didn't some go on for 4 hours?
That's right. Well, we actually met at Mar-a-Lago. He wanted to be at Mar-a-Lago, and we had a 15-minute meeting scheduled. When he comes in, we were going to go into breakout rooms where we had many people waiting for us, and it ended up lasting 4 hours. The 15 minutes, President of China, great guy, it ended up lasting for 4 hours. We just got along, and we have gotten along. I mean, I want him to treat us better on trade. That's my only problem. They've been killing us.
Didn't they make concessions on intellectual property?
Well,
trade?
They want to do things. It's a tough thing. They're doing so well. They've made so much progress against us for so many years. It's awfully tough for them to bring it back. And we'll see how that all works out. We're gonna do something. Definitely, we're gonna do something. They offered us $80 billion in purchases of agricultural products, but it's just not enough for what we're talking about. It's $80 billion.
What do you want?
Never thought I'd turn down $80 billion, but we have to do something with intellectual property. We have to do something just generally on trade. Last year we lost $500 billion with China. We can't do that anymore.
So the president is really stressing how important it is to him that America is treated fairly on trade. And for a nation like China, which they have benefited so greatly from the relationship, doing business with us has been just a buffet of awesomeness for them. They've not only been able to poach our intellectual property to create products to sell within their own markets and in Asia, they have been able to just by osmosis, by having our factories there, by seeing how we set up a factory, how we engage with employees, even though their employees are working for a pittance compared to what Americans would work for, to see the management structures. They've gotten to interface with some of the brightest minds our country has on not just their products, but other business interests. And they've done all of this while maintaining their communist stranglehold on their billion citizens, but advancing the cause of catching up to America. You know, they have the 2036 initiative where by the year 2036, they expect to replace us as the #1 economy on the planet and vie for the reserve currency of nations to no longer be the US dollar, but to be their instrument, their monetary instrument. Why is that important to us? Well, being the reserve currency means the default language that's spoken in business is English. Yes, a lot of our business people speak multiple languages. It's not that you're required to speak English, but it's kind of the default. English is the additional language that most nations have their children learn as they're growing up, because they assume that the world that we live in is one where English speakers dominate the landscape. With a rising China, that also would change. So it's not about saying that China's society is not as good as ours or that we don't want the Chinese people to rise up and do well. They're already doing that. But what we are saying is that a world that the reserve currency, in which the reserve currency is someone who is a communist nation, is going to be different than one where it's a capitalistic nation that's based on freedom and liberty for everyone, but specifically for the citizens of that country. This is something that has been allowed to happen and progress over all of the previous presidencies up until Donald Trump. And so, you know, there's this big, it's a conversation that I keep hearing. People keep coming back to it. People that didn't care that Bill Clinton did the things that he did when he was president. People that actually think pornography is just like regular television. People who think that, you know, nudity and all of that stuff, they're against the swimsuit competition at Miss America, but they're fine with nudity on television, same-sex relationships promoted as the norm, and the advancement of the transgender, it's a movement. They're fine with all of that, but they're not okay with just this. This is a flawed person. Donald Trump made mistakes. They were fine watching him on TV. They knew he'd been married multiple times and had had affairs when he was on TV. But now that he's the president, all of a sudden there's this new morality that people are trying to drape themselves in, and it just isn't flying. It's not, it doesn't work. If you only have morality and shock and disgust for people who make mistakes and are flawed individuals when they're on the right, but when they're on the left, their sins are justified and instantly forgiven, then don't be surprised when people stop paying attention to your criticisms and critiques. And that's what's happening, really. So when we get back, we're going to have our first guest for you on the program. Wonderful to speak to Deigo Echeverri right after this.
One of my favorite things to do in Israel is take a boat ride on the Sea of Galilee. Tell everyone I'm Tim Wildman, president of American Family Association and American Family Radio. We'll be taking our annual tour of Israel in March of 2019, but it's time to sign up. We have a lot of folks sign up early, and last year, in fact, we filled up several months in advance. So for all the information on this trip to Israel, a bucket list trip for most people, go to the website twholyland.com. That's twholyland.com. Or for a free brochure, call us at 800-FAMILIES, 800-FAMILIES, option 5, and leave us your name and your phone number. We'll be flying direct from the States to Tel Aviv and then begin our tour in Jerusalem of Israel. We hope you can join us in 2019.
Hi, I'm Crawford Loritz with a Legacy Moment. Some years ago, Karen and I went through a time of discouragement. It was a stretch in our lives where we really needed the love and encouragement of trusted friends, and God in His grace gave us what we needed. A pastor friend and his dear wife came alongside us and gave us a listening ear. They showered us with encouragement and love. Then in recent years, God gave us the joy and privilege of ministering to that very couple and encouraging them in their time of need. We will never forget what they did for us. In 2 Samuel chapter 19, David models for us what we ought to do for those who have helped us in the past. David and his men were in the wilderness running from his son Absalom. While he was out there in the wilderness, an 80-year-old man by the name of Barzillai came alongside and brought them supplies and gave them refreshment and much-needed encouragement. Now David was back in Jerusalem and things were simmering down. Listen to what David did. Verse 39. All the people crossed over to Jordan, and the king crossed too. The king then kissed Barzillai and blessed him, and he returned to his place. There are some things we need to keep in mind based on this encounter. Number one, honor those who have helped you, especially the elderly. Number two, do all that you can to show your appreciation. Please say thank you to people. Then number three, you will need help in the future. Don't forget about those who have helped you in the past. You might need those same folks tomorrow. Well, here's what I want you to remember today. Remember those who have been a blessing in your life. Find out how you can bless and encourage them. You will reap a harvest of joy.
Crawford Loritz is senior pastor of Fellowship Bible Church in suburban Atlanta, Georgia. For more information, go to livingalegacy.org. livingalegacy.org.
Welcome back to Stacy on the Right on Urban Family Talk.
Welcome back to the show, everybody. Thanks for being here today. Is it Wednesday? Oh, it is. Happy Hump Day. Middle of the week. Ready to get it done. It's my pleasure to welcome Deigo Echeverri, Director of Coalitions for Concerned Veterans for America. Hey, Deigo, thanks for joining in today.
Happy Hump Day. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so first off, you are a good friend of associate producer of the Stacy on the Right show, Demetrius Minor, who books all the guests and booked you. And he was just texting me saying he's my friend and colleague, and I'm like, yes, he brings us really wonderful guests. I'm so excited about getting to talk to you about the Mission Act today.
Well, thanks to Demetrius. He's a great colleague, and happy to be on the same team as him. And thank you so much for having me on to talk about the Mission Act. H.R. 5674, which was signed by the president last week. It was an exciting piece of news for us at CVA, who've been fighting this fight for several years now, since 2012. Since the initial funding of the Veterans Choice Program was deployed last year, Congress has twice authorized supplemental funding, and it failed to make significant reforms to the VA healthcare choice. By the end of last month, the funding for the Veterans Choice Program was due to run out. So the fact that Congress moved so quickly on the Mission Act to pass it through Congress and the Senate had, I believe there were only 5 no votes against it, all Democrats, and in the House there were about 70 no votes. But there was bipartisan support in the House and in the Senate for this bill. So we're really excited that the president signed it so quickly to make sure that we were able to overhaul, expand, and permanently reform the Veterans Choice Program so that veterans get better choice in their health care decision.
So a couple of the things that the bill does, and it's kind of expansive. It greatly enlarges the VA Family Caregiver Program. It establishes the Center for Innovation for Care and Payment and the Asset and Infrastructure Review Commission. Can you give us some kind of layman's explanations on exactly why you supported the bill and why you're so excited that it's now law?
Sure. So I'll dumb it down. Essentially what this bill does, it's an amalgamation of several different bills that we supported, and it was a compromise also to include other bills like expanding community care. But essentially what this bill does and what CVA supports in this bill is that it makes permanent the VA choice program. After the 2012 VA scandal in Phoenix, where hundreds of veterans died while waiting for care, this new program called the Veterans Choice Program was created. Now, that program kept running out of money. And in fact, in the last couple of years, it ran out of money twice. And as I mentioned, there had to be emergency funding for the program. This bill makes the choice program permanent. And why is the choice program good, or why is it necessary? Because many veterans were dying while waiting for care, because the choice program also was running out of funding. So this bill fixed that. At the VA, as you know, there's for many years there's been problems with delayed care, with access to care, secret wait lists, and this is still occurring even today after the scandals. So the choice program allows veterans to seek care outside of the VA. They can go to a private healthcare provider to meet their needs. Many veterans have to make appointments that are outside of their geographic area, and that's an undue hardship for many people who are settling down, who are trying to keep down a steady job, who are going to school and getting their lives together after their military service. So the choice program allowed veterans to seek access to care in their community, which we really support. So that's the biggest thing with the Mission Act and why we were so supportive of it, and why we believe in it so strongly is that veterans deserve access to community care, to private health care, because the government health care has failed us time and time again.
So when you say when you say they deserve access to it, I'm a veteran. My husband and I are veterans, and we made a conscious decision not to access the VA medical system when we left active duty. We had medical insurance through work, so we didn't ever, seek out those benefits or try to use them. We weren't retirees; we were veterans, just plain old veterans. So, for people who are leaving the service and separating, and they either don't have access to health care through their new job or they're unemployed or what have you, what you're saying is that veterans' medical insurance that's provided to them through the VA is now expanded and goes out into the private sector. So they'll be able to behave as my husband and I did, only using private doctors, but they're doing so as a benefit that they're receiving from, from being on active duty.
Okay, so not entirely. It's only for those veterans who already qualify, depending on their disability status. And as you know, not every veteran is disabled. Not every veteran is qualified to go to the VA for every service. It depends on your disability rating and what you're going there for. But I guess the crux of your question is, do veterans now have better access to outside care than at the VA as an option? And that's yes. The answer to that is yes. Veterans will now have better access to care outside those who qualify for VA benefits. And for those who retired, depending on whether or not a lot of retirees choose TRICARE Prime, some of them stay on TRICARE. For those who decide to do a patchwork of healthcare, of using private side and the VA side, what we're seeing, too, is that there's a lot of veterans. For example, in my home state of Florida, we have 600 or 700,000 veterans who use a combination of private health care and the VA. And then there's a similar number, about less than 600,000, that use a combination of Medicaid, Medicare, and the VA. So regardless of where you're at, the great majority of veterans use a combination already of private and public health care. A big reason for that is because the VA is inadequate in meeting the needs of today's veterans. And what we're so scared about, myself as a post-9/11 veteran, and the other folks on our team who are post-9/11 veterans, is that the VA right now was built for yesterday's veterans, not for today's and tomorrow's veterans. So what we need is more legislation like the VA Mission Act that will be able to be forward-thinking and have a VA that will better be able to meet the needs of tomorrow's veterans and today's veterans, the post-9/11 veteran. And that's why we also support legislation like the Veterans Empowerment Act, which from the get-go provides access to choice and portability of health care. The VEA is the bill, in short. The Veteran Empowerment Act, it was sponsored by Doug Lamborn out of Colorado. It was introduced in November. It just hasn't moved anywhere. But what that does is two main things. It takes the VHA, which is the hospital system, out from under the VA and turns it to a government-chartered nonprofit that would have oversight from both sides of the aisle. and the VA director would sit on that board. So you'd have continuity in leadership, continuity in vision, which has been a big problem. The average VA director only lasts 1.7 years. So that's not enough time to really oversee a 300-plus thousand person organization with a budget of $200 billion. No one can adequately follow through on a vision to reform an organization like that. So that's why a board is so necessary to have. The other thing that the VEA does, the Veteran Empowerment Act does, is it creates something called the Veterans Health Insurance Program. So that from the get-go, a veteran would be able to use their insurance card. The system would be modeled on TRICARE Prime, and a veteran would be able to go to any private health care provider they choose, and it would force the VA to compete for patients with the private sector. It would cause the VA to really step up their game. They're focused on the veteran as a customer. They're focused on the veteran as a patient instead of what we've seen for the last many, many years, which is that the VA is focused on the VA employee, the unions. The unions have a stranglehold on the VA, and they've been the biggest impediment to reform and to fixing the VA healthcare system.
Wow. So I hadn't realized that the turnover for the leadership of the VA was, I mean, obviously you remember every time one of them steps down or is replaced, but that's actually really frequent. Less than 2 years per person is more frequent than probably any position that we have in government for a normal rotation of leadership.
Absolutely. It's scary. When you think about the fact that in the last 10 years, that's typically what they average. And that includes those who were temporary people who were overseeing in the meantime while other people were appointed. But regardless, I mean, it's a staggering statistic.
It is. So you talked about this being a first step. You want to see more legislation that helps veterans. What else are you looking for? The president and obviously Congress has to pass the legislation for him to sign it. What are you looking for them to do?
Well, we're looking for people to go to our website, cb4a.org. They can learn more. They can sign up to get emails. What we need is to put pressure on members of Congress to support legislation that fixes the VA, like the Veteran Empowerment Act. The VA Mission Act is not still in our rearview mirror because right now we're worried about the implementation side. The bill didn't include specific funding in it. So we need to hold our legislators accountable on the Mission Act to make sure that they put it into work the right way. So what does that mean? Folks need to put pressure on their member of Congress to support implementation of the Mission Act. And then in the future, the VEA is our long-term goal to get something passed like that where we have the Veterans Health Insurance Program, the VHA turns into a government-chartered nonprofit. There's also legislation like the Vet Protection Act. What we found recently, the GAO report that exposed that over 300 employees at the VA were devoting 100% of their time to union activity. That included nurses and physicians. There was a physician that was paid over $200,000 a year, and in that year they did nothing but union activities. They didn't see a single patient. So we think that that's a major conflict, and we think that that's an issue that we're using taxpayer dollars to bankroll unions when these physicians, nurses, and healthcare practitioners should be seeing patients, should be seeing veterans. So what the Vet Protection Act does is it caps that amount of official time that they can devote to union activities to 25%. The other thing that it does is it bars clinicians from participating in union activities on official time. And we think this is a totally reasonable argument because nowhere else in government and nowhere else in the job market are people allowed to participate in extracurriculars like this, like union activities. So we hope that folks will sign on to the Vet Protection Act, that your listeners and callers will reach out to their members of Congress and ask them to support the Vet Protection Act, to sign on as a co-sponsor of that bill so that we can get this very reasonable legislation passed and further reforms to fix the VA.
Wow. I have no words for how wrong it is to hear that someone who's been trained as a medical professional, a nurse, a doctor, spends 100% of their time doing union stuff and not seeing patients. Meanwhile, people are dying waiting on an appointment. It's like a horrible movie that you watch where you're outraged, but at the end of the movie you kind of get to calm down and say, but we know that's not true. That's just a movie. only this is true. It's real. It's happening. And our government is allowing it. So, I'm just really grateful that you've been able to get this far. And the next step, we definitely need to take that. Give the information again so people can find out more about how they can help and add their voices.
They can go to cv4a.org, which is our website, Concerned Veterans for America, cv4a.org, and they can click on any of the tabs that talk about policy, and they can learn more. They can sign up to volunteer for us, and they can also reach out to their members of Congress to support the legislation I mentioned. So cv4a.org.
All right. I had someone in the chat ask, why can't we just give vets a medical card that gives them service everywhere and disband the VA? And I said, because that makes too much sense. So.
Well, I do want to say we're not for disbanding the VA because we know that many veterans get quality care. It's just not consistent across the board. And there are many veterans and military family members that work at the VA. And we know that their hearts are in the right place and that many veterans do get excellent quality. The problem isn't those patients and those employees. It's the bad employees that are the problem, that are making it very, very difficult for the cream to rise to the top, so to say. And there's many bad apples at the VA, and we need to fix it. And that's why CVA, I'm really proud to be part of this organization because we've been so successful in advocating for many pieces of legislation in the last several years. The VA Accountability Act, the VA Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Act were both signed by the presidents, and they passed Congress, and these have slowly reformed, and that's what we're all about. We're about incremental change because we know that there are a lot of interested parties here, and what we don't want to do is completely dismantle the VA because they have a comparative advantage in several areas. They have many, many years and decades of experience treating veterans, but we just want them to refocus their attention on the veteran instead of the VA employee. And we think that can be done by working with folks on both sides of the aisle to make sure that we refocus their attention on the veteran as the patient, as the customer. And we're seeing all of those things happen thanks to President Trump's leadership, thanks to the House and the Senate. The leaders in both the Senate VA Committee and the House VA Committee, we're seeing all the right steps happen. More reform on the VA has happened in the last couple of years than it happened in the last two generations combined. Or rather, last two presidents combined. So we're very, very excited.
And I am too. And I really appreciate the work that you guys are doing. It's cv4a.org, Concerned Veterans for America. Thank you so much for coming on today, Deigo, and what you're doing to help veterans get access to medical care.
Thank you so much.
All right. Great to talk to you. So we have just a wonderful continuation of and more information. I'll give you a little preview for next segment. We have Mitch McConnell talking about the possibility of this agreement, if you will. Now, we know that the piece of paper that they signed was more symbolic than actual having teeth. And we know this because anything that's a treaty has to be ratified by Congress. So that was just a first step for them. And I think it was great to see Kim Jong-un and the president actually symbolically joining together to sign that piece of paper that kind of lays out what they hope to do. We'll talk about that, and we'll take your calls, 866-963-2037. Stay there.
the Iran deal to make sure that these terms of this tentative agreement are enforced. What does that look like?
Yeah, well, I think there'd be widespread interest in Congress for having an involvement in this. If the president can reach a significant agreement with the North Koreans, I hope it takes the form of a treaty. That's what the founders of our country anticipated, and that's why it's in the Constitution. We obviously have precedent for things less than that, but which route the administration takes will be up to them. But I do believe they'll need to come to Congress in some form, and we'll wait and see what form that takes.
So that's the standard procedure. I'm glad he came out and shared it, but there's nothing unusual about the president going out and creating a new diplomatic environment in which to come to a place where they can build a treaty that would then have to be ratified in Congress before it could be signed into law by the president. So in other words, business as usual, instead of President Trump trying to take the pen and phone route as President Obama did and say, well, you know, I guess I'm going to go ahead and create a relationship with these people, drop some paperwork and some documents, and get South Korean leaders to sign it, and we sign it, and North Korean leaders to sign it, and then I use an executive order to place it into what I would consider to be operation. That's what President Obama did with the Iran deal. And now we're finding out that he actually asked banking institutions here in the United States to circumvent the sanctions that were in place in order to convert money that was going to be sent to the Iranians into currency that they could use. And when they refused, he just got a pallet of cash and sent it to Switzerland and had them convert it and then flew the pallet to Iran. I mean, if that's not some... I'm going to save my characterizations for my private time because I think maybe not suitable for here. Not profane, but not suitable for here. All right, I want to talk to you about one of the ballot initiatives that just passed and will be available for Californians to vote on. And it's something that will split the state of California into 3 individual states, one of which would be, it would be a Republican state. So the Republicans in the state of California won out. The Democrats love the idea because if California is split into 3 states, it's our #1 most populous state. If it were split, then you'd have an additional 4 senators because right now they only have 2. Each state has 2 senators. They'd actually have 6. And they would double the number of liberal senators because 2 of the new states would be heavily populated by Democratic strongholds in big cities. So you'd have 4 senators for the Democrats and then 2 new ones for the Republicans. But there are a number of really thorny issues that come alongside trying to split California up. Now, California's been a state for 168 years, and the majority of the voters who have the opportunity to cast a ballot could change the makeup of the state. So it would be, if it happens, the first division of an existing U.S. state since the creation of West Virginia in 1863. And this is an interesting proposal. I'll put the link in online so you guys can find it. If you're interested in seeing what it looks like, basically Northern California, which includes Sacramento and San Francisco, that would be one chunk. That'd be one state. And then just below that, the city of Monterey, and down the coast, that would be one skinny sliver of land that was basically all coastal. That would be the second state. And it would actually retain the name California. It would go from Monterey to Los Angeles. So Northern California would be the first new state that I described to you that includes Sacramento and San Francisco. The second state, which would be the original name, California, would encompass from Monterey all the way down the coast to Los Angeles. And then if you continue on down the coast, you hit San Diego. Then the remainder of the state that's left behind that, which you can kind of see here if you're watching on one of the live streams, and you can find this at NYTimes Graphics on Twitter. If you go there, you'll see this graphic as well. And that third portion would be called Southern California, and it would include Fresno, Bakersfield, Riverside, and San Diego. So these 3 states, according to Tim Draper, the Silicon Valley venture capitalist who sponsored the ballot measure, would give them better infrastructure, better education, and lower taxes. Now, when he formally submitted the proposal, it was last summer, and he was talking about it then and saying that states would be more accountable to us and could cooperate and compete for citizens. And he argued that vast parts of California are poorly served by representative government dominated by a large number of elected representatives from a small part of our state, both geographically and economically. The proposal also aims to invoke Article 4, Section 3 of the U.S. Constitution, which is a provision that guides how an existing state can be divided into new states. Draper's plan calls for the three entities that I described, and it would divide the population of the existing state into thirds. Northern California would actually have 40 counties stretching from Oregon south to Santa Cruz County, then east to Merced and Maricopa counties. Southern California would begin with Madera County in the Central Valley and wind its way along the existing state's eastern and southern spine, comprising 12 counties and ultimately curving up the Pacific coast to grab San Diego and Orange counties. Now, Los Angeles County would anchor the 6 counties that retain the name California under the long shot proposal. And so I described to you what that looks like. Now, it's economic sustainability that helped fell 2 of his previous efforts. So this isn't Draper's first time proposing this. He actually brought it up in 2012 and again in 2014. In those iterations of his proposal, he wanted to create 6 California states. Now, critics of those proposals said that the more rural regions would suffer from extraordinary rates of poverty as individual states, while coastal communities flourished in new, smaller states where the lion's share of California's tax revenue would be generated. Yeah, it's always about that tax revenue. So it was a fumble by Draper's political team that doomed the 6-state effort. The campaign collected hundreds of thousands of signatures in 2014, only to see too many of them invalidated by election officials. Now, last September, he submitted the modified version that he calls Cal 3. And in that one, he basically, he has the signatures that he needs, which is the 402,468 of them. And out of all of the ones that were counted, that number represents the ones that were valid. And there are more than enough of them to be included on the November ballot. Now, there are 16, possibly more, propositions that will also be under consideration for the deadline of certification for later this month. Draper has spent, at last count, $4.9 million of his own money on the unsuccessful signature drive in 2014. He only spent $559,000 on this one. So it's not a shock that California is having these kinds of growing pains. More than 200 attempts to reconfigure California's boundaries have been attempted over the course of its history. And there's also, in addition to those things, a Cal exit proposal, which continues to be bandied about for the ballot in 2020. And that's where California, because it is a huge economy, bigger than a lot of our trading partners, on its own, separate and apart from the United States, that they want to make California its own country. Now, I got to say, the only reason that I would want to keep California in America as a part of our union is because it's the coastline. So it represents the coast. It completes the boundaries of our nation. You have the East Coast and the West Coast, and those, without any other country to the left or the right of us, present a powerful form of protection for us. You have to approach our country not from inland. In other words, you're already on the land that we share, and then you just come across some line, imaginary line or border, or some fence that we would erect. You can stage operations from that coast. All of those things can happen if you actually have that as a country that we don't control. And I actually think that's what would happen. If California were to secede, China would move to take over California they try to do it peacefully with a show of force and annexation. And the United States government would be forced to protect California and reabsorb it back into the United States. California has a National Guard, but they don't have a standing army and the attendant resources that they would need to defend themselves against, China. And they would adore to have China, a piece of it, on our continent where they could literally just cross over into America if they wanted to. That is why, and it's the only reason why, because I think California is largely a lost cause as it pertains to politics. And that just the overall thought of the state, it bends to lawlessness and is utterly unaccountable for the horrible policy failures that currently govern the entire state. So the piece goes on to discuss the 6 seats that they would have as opposed to the current 100-member Senate. They'd have a 104-member chamber. It would dilute the power of the other states and increase the power of what used to be a single state, because the 6 senators could band together on various issues. And they also consulted with Vikram Amar, a law professor who's written extensively about Draper's plans, who pointed out last fall that the shift in California's votes in the Electoral College, which have been awarded for a quarter century to Democratic nominees, would be split between 3 states, and one of those states, based on past election results, would be won by a Republican. So while the Senate situation would be detrimental to Republicans, the presidential outlook would be greatly improved because there's a huge chunk of California that's extremely conservative, and they vote that way. So Amar was writing about this, and he said that he feels Democrats would be very reluctant to risk supporting the proposal in Congress because of that the Electoral College mix. The other issue is that even though it is lawful to raise this as a ballot initiative, it actually would rise to the need possibly of making a revision to the California Constitution, and that can only be instigated by the legislature or by a formal constitutional convention. Revisions are generally seen in the courts as the most substantial kinds of changes to a government. So, what could be more important to a state's government than the geographic boundaries and it would represent a material change to the way that people in California live. He also brings up the issue of people who are currently California state residents enjoying in-state tuition at the University of California system, the system of universities. If the state was split into 3 and you didn't live in a part of it that contained a part of the university system, then you would be an out-of-state student unless there was a provision for that included in all of the different details that would have to be ironed out. So it's a fascinating proposal. I think this is interesting because this is the closest they've gotten to ever bringing it to fruition. And so I'm interested in seeing how it goes. But I feel completely confident that it's not going to actually happen, mainly because the Democrats will oppose it vehemently because they don't want their Electoral College win of California diluted. It's their path to the presidency every single time they win. It goes through California. What they hope to do is to have enough people move from California and Illinois who vote liberally but want lower taxes to move to the state of Texas so they can turn it blue. Remains to be seen if that will actually work for them. We're at the end of this hour. In hour 2, I'm really excited to get the opportunity to interview Arno Michaelis, former white supremacist and co-author of the book, The Gift of Our Wounds. That is going to be a fantastic interview. Can't wait to get into that. And I have a little bit of audio for you of the video that was created by, apparently the State Department commissioned the video that was shown to Kim Jong-un, and he was given a copy to take home with him. And I kind of thought, marketing-wise, I said it, I'll say it again, it was brilliant. It was brilliant to give him something to take home so that instead of him just remembering getting a tour of the president's limousine or remembering looking out over the balcony and talking about the beaches there in Singapore, that he was able to take something home with him that he could not only look at and show his wife and children, but that he could present to others in leadership who, support his regime, people who help him make decisions, so that they could look at the pros and the cons of what's being proposed. Brilliant. And more proof that the president was actually prepared for the meeting. So we have all of that and more for you. Right now, you have important News and information from onenewsnow.com coming at you in just a couple of seconds. Keep it here for more Stacey on the Right after this.
Urban Family Talk. Urban Family Talk.
As millennials, we have more than $1 trillion in purchasing power, so you know businesses are watching us. But millennials are losing our faith, so we know Satan is watching us. Engage Magazine is for millennials by millennials, and it speaks to faith, purpose, and a closer walk with Jesus. Because above all, God is watching us. Visit engagemagazine.net and listen Saturday afternoons at 5:30 Central on AFR.
Truth, wisdom, empowerment. Urban Family Talk, a ministry of the American Family Association.
For American Family News on the Hour, I'm Chris Woodward. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says he is taking the lead on U.S. talks with North Korea and that he expects detailed talks to resume next week. Speaking from Seoul, South Korea, Pompeo told reporters that U.S.-South Korea military exercises will resume if North Korea stops negotiating in good faith over its nuclear program. He also said that the Trump administration is hopeful that major disarmament steps will occur before the end of Trump's term in January 2021. Should California be broken up into 3 states? Jessica Rosenthal reports that is the question before voters this November.
A measure to split California into 3 parts has qualified for the ballot. Spokeswoman for Cal 3, Peggy Grandy, says they got more than 700,000 signatures, far more than needed.
California is broken. It's too big to govern. It's too big to function. In every statistic, we are failing. We're lowest in K-12 education. We're highest in taxes. We're running businesses out of the state.
Prior efforts to do this, though, have failed. And Grandy says this time they split them up in 3 parts, giving each access to the coastline. She says they took industry and household incomes into account, but it could still be a really tough sell. A poll done in April found just 17% of Californians support the idea. Jessica Rosenthal, Fox News.
A conservative activist says a California school acted cowardly in forcing him to sign a waiver absolving the school of any responsibility for any harm that he might incur during a recent speaking engagement. We get that story from AFN's Bob Kellogg.
At first, he declined, but David Horowitz of the Freedom Center says the college Republicans who invited him were so disappointed he changed his mind. But in order to appear, college officials made him sign a waiver that said they would not be responsible for any harm that might befall him.
This waiver, washing their hands of any responsibility for anything that might happen to me, is just a ludicrous extension of the principle of washing your hands of responsibility.
He believes schools like UC Santa Cruz could take steps to significantly reduce the threats to conservative speakers if they wanted to.
They know who the potential violent students are, and instead of dealing with them, they throw the burden on us.
There was a protest during his visit, but Horowitz says they remained outside and he didn't even see them. To their credit, he says the school did provide a significant police presence during his visit. I'm Bob Kellogg.
The pastor of the Texas church that suffered one of the worst mass shootings in U.S. history is still praising God in the midst of the tragedy that happened last November. Here's AFN's Bill Bumpus.
Here at the Southern Baptist Convention annual meeting in Dallas, First Baptist Church Sutherland Springs pastor Frank Pomeroy spoke to messengers about the strength of his faith in Christ despite the deaths of 26 people in the church at the hands of a gunman, including his own daughter.
My faith has been made 10 times stronger because I now see that in the midst of what I perceived to be a trial that was insurmountable, my God said that's just the seed for revival like you've never seen.
Pomeroy says he's blessed by the witness of his church.
I stand here as a pastor of a flock who chose not hate and divisiveness. They chose Christ.
The pastor says God is blessing First Baptist Sutherland Springs.
We went from about 75 in attendance to, on a regular Sunday now, 200 in attendance. We're having baptisms almost every Sunday. And we got another one coming this Sunday, praise God.
The SBC's North American Mission Board recently announced it's accepting donations and will cover all of the construction expenses for a new church building that will be completed by early next year. I'm Bill Bumpus in Dallas.
In final news this hour, the Federal Reserve is raising its benchmark interest rate for the second time this year and signaling that it may step up its pace of rate increases because of solid economic growth and rising inflation. The Fed now foresees 4 rate hikes this year, up from the 3 it had previously forecast.
Abraham Hamilton III.
God put us in this world at this time to be salt and light. We don't fold because of the darkness that we're facing. This is not the first time in the world's history that it's gotten dark. God has called you and I to be his ambassadors, even in this dark moment.
Tune in to the Hamilton Corner, weekdays at 5 p.m. Central on Urban Family Talk. Welcome to Stacy on the Right with your host, Stacy Washington.
Times of relative peace and times of great tension. While this cycle repeats, the light of prosperity and innovation has burned bright for most of the world. History is always evolving, and there comes a time when only a few are called upon to make a difference. But the question is, what difference will the few make? The past doesn't have to be the future. Out of the darkness can come the light, and the light of hope can burn bright. What if a people that share a common and rich heritage can find a common future? Their story is well known, but what will be their sequel? Destiny Pictures presents a story of opportunity, a new story, a new beginning, one of peace, 2 men, 2 leaders, 1 destiny. A story about a special moment in time when a man is presented with one chance that may never be repeated. What will he choose? To show vision and leadership? Or not?
So there's more to it after that, and I thought it was just so, I got to tip my hat. It is fascinating. And in the video, they have images of, I think it's Michael Jordan dunking the ball. They have images of factories and people working. They have images of very brief images of war, but most of the images are of prosperity. There's a couple of images of Donald Trump on Air Force One, coming down, images of Kim Jong-un and the president. It's one of those things where you can hear by the music, you can hear by the sound of it that it's meant to evoke a response. There are even some images in the video of our aircraft carriers launching planes. And if you have never, so there's a show on TLC. I don't know if it still runs, as in they make new shows, but it's called How It's Made. And one of the different episodes that they had on there was like an expose. I'm not even sure if it was a How It's Made episode, but I know it was on TLC, and it was about aircraft carriers. Now, if you're a military hardware person, this is the show for you to watch. It's all about how it's not just that the planes are on top of the aircraft carrier and they take off and land there, and what the men and women who work on the aircraft carrier have to do to make that possible. but it's also about the fact that an aircraft carrier has elevators on it so that aircraft that need to be worked on can go onto the section where the elevator is, and they're lowered down below, slid off into an area where crew chiefs can take them apart and work on them like cars, only they're aircraft. And so they showed that. They showed some of the technological advances. And in that piece, it just makes you get a little, you say to yourself, glory to God. It's like, what can't people do when they put their heads together and decide they want to do something with technology? Landing planes on a metal boat that has an elevator in it to put the planes down below. It's almost like the things you see the kids play with when they make Lego creations, only these are real things that are, they're huge. They're things that we can actually use. And so the imagery in this piece it's perfect. It's the kind of stuff that you want people to think about when they're considering. They present the stark reality of war in images, and then they present the opportunities and everything else that's not war, and how a partnership could bring all those other things to reality. And so I'm glad that the president made this, but it's not something that they were able to just. This isn't a bunch of imagery and voiceover, and especially having it voiced over in Korean, that they were able to just put together over the weekend before the summit. This was the result of the first meetings of Secretary Pompeo going to Korea and meeting with leadership from North Korea and initiating the relationship. And then he brought information back, and that's what they were operating off of, including their signals intelligence and satellite imagery and all of that stuff. They were able to come up with this. And I gotta say, I thought it was fascinating. Watching the video and understanding, you kind of have to back yourself out of, I see a video here, 4 minutes and 13 seconds. I know for a fact, based on what people charge me to put videos together, not only is it not cheap, it's very time consuming getting a person to agree to edit video for you and put it together into a presentable form and add background music. And then the voiceover adds yet another layer of complexity. And you have to do it with someone who actually speaks good Korean that would be, done in a way that's not offensive, spoken well. All of those things had to come together. And it had to be finished and ready to go when the president left for the G7, right? Because the president went to the G7 first. So I saw some information from the White House press corps. They traveled over 24,000 miles. They spent 48 hours in the air flying, and they visited a number of countries between the day that the president was wheels up for the G7 summit in Canada to their arrival back at home. Pretty amazing. So I just, this is where we share the truth, and we you don't have to change your mind, but I do feel like one of the things all of us should be able to agree on is what's true and what's not true. So the assertion that our president wasn't prepared, that he didn't spend time getting ready for this, the fact that he said a number of times, I've been preparing for this all my life. He meant he's been preparing for this all his life, and that he's had these kinds of consequential meetings with people before, and he knows how to prepare for a meeting. It didn't mean that he didn't that he spent zero time preparing for this meeting. But he wasn't going to tell us what he did because he didn't want everyone to know, including Kim Jong-un, before they had a chance to meet. Very logical, very, very sensible. So now let's pivot over to, there were a number of primaries yesterday. June 12th was primary day all over the country for a number of races. And Joe Scarborough over at Morning Joe is really upset that Mark Sanford lost his race in the Republican Party primary. Joe Scarborough thinks that the Republican Party is now a Trumpist cult. It's number 7.
Mark Sanford survives a career-ending, what should have been a career-ending scandal. As governor, lies about going on the Appalachian Trail, becomes the butt of late-night jokes. Nobody said that guy would ever be elected back to Congress, and he won. Yeah. 2 years later, he votes with Trump maybe 95% of the time.
Not quite, but close. 87, I believe.
87%. Says one or two things about Trump that people don't like.
Off with his head.
And is so conservative.
Yeah.
Conservative, really conservative, not a Trumpist. So conservative that even the Freedom Caucus said we would not have passed the tax cuts without Mark. There is no more conservative person on protecting tax dollars, balancing the budget, paying down the debt. It's been that's been Mark's sole obsession since 1994. But primary voters are like, no, you know what? We don't care that he's like one of the most conservative people in Congress. He said one or two bad things about Trump.
Yep. It's, well, look, there are two things to say. There are a lot of things to say about this, but the two...
Why don't we just start to say it has devolved into a cult? Primary voters in the Republican Party have devolved into a Trumpist cult.
Right. Well, it's clear that conservatism, liberalism, voting records, none of those things matter. It is a cult of personality, and the president has an extraordinary hold over his base.
So the person that you're listening to speaking there is John Heilemann, and he's on with Mika Brzezinski, who you don't hear in that clip, and then, of course, Joe Scarborough. And they're discussing this race where Mark Sanford, who has the interesting background, you know, he said he was hiking the Appalachians when he was really in Argentina with his girlfriend, and he, you know, divorced his wife for this woman. They're no longer together. The wife was the mother of his 4 children, and so it was just a huge scandal. And instead of going away, he rallied the voters around himself and went into the Senate. And so now he's been primaried, and they're blaming his loss on statements he made about the president. So I guess for me, when I listen to the MSNBC hosts say it's a cult of personality, that Donald Trump is the main reason why Mark Sanford lost, they're completely disregarding the opponent. What did the opponent say? The other thing that I find interesting is MSNBC is a news organization. They could easily partner with Quinnipiac or Morning Consult or anyone. So news agencies have the ability to make a phone call or an email and ask a polling agency, let's partner together and do a poll. Let's find out why the voters actually ousted, you know, Mark Sanford for his primary challenger. And they can do the poll of, you know, you can do a teeny poll of 300 voters, which only takes a couple of days to stand up and complete. You can do a much more in-depth poll with 7 questions. I mean, anyone can contact a polling organization and put together a poll. You know, you have to tell them what your budget is, and they'll execute a poll for you. I know organizations here in Missouri that privately execute polls to kind of gauge voter confidence on this or that so that they can move an issue. They either decide not to move it or to move it based on what they learned through their polling. And they use other things too, but the polls are a part of the equation. So wouldn't it have been great if Morning Joe had said, you know, instead of making these round statements and condemnations of the voters who made this decision, if they'd said, well, you know, when you look at the candidacy of this Mark Sanford, you know, we're seeing this, we're seeing that. The person who is running against him is saying this, is saying that. Over and over and over again, we have the opportunity to understand exactly what happened. And instead of the people at MSNBC doing that, they chose instead to basically malign the voters. So the person who beat him is Katie Arrington. So could it be that the voters there decided they didn't want Mark Sanford anymore because they do remember his background and his history? And even though he was a reliable vote and helped pass the tax reform bill, he's also someone who, if you compare him to the Me Too movement, yes, he had a consensual affair, but it was a very ugly story, very ugly. And they gave him the opportunity to go to the Senate, and he didn't say nice things about the president. And so all of those things mixed together in a maelstrom. And then you've got Katie Arrington, who they felt was a good candidate. Now, sure enough, Donald Trump, instead of coming out early for Katie Arrington, he sent a tweet out with just hours left at the polls saying she was the candidate to support. And he referenced, the fact that Sanford would be better off in Argentina. Now, Arrington, during the course of the campaign, did blast Sanford as a never Trumper. And, these are all factors. So it's not that I don't, it could be that the majority of the angst that was felt towards Sanford and the reason that he was, primaried and he's no longer there is because he said things that were not flattering to Donald Trump. But I don't think that's it. I don't think that's the entirety of it. And I just, this is one of those situations where when I see a story like this, when I hear the audio from Morning Joe, I wish that they would do that extra step of finding out why, because I think it would be interesting. It would actually be an interesting story for a news organization like that to reach out to a polling organization or to check with anyone who did exit polling and find out why the voters were so much more energized by Katie Arrington. It could be that they wanted to send a woman from their state to the Senate. It could have really been less about Donald Trump and more about who she is and her campaign style and her energy than Mark Sanford. We won't know that, of course, unless someone is willing to drop some change and ask the voters. So I guess we'll see, won't we? I mean, we'll see what she can do in the general, and we'll see if that support lasts through. But it's an interesting story. One of the interesting stories from last night, there were a number of them. All right, we get to speak with Arno Michaelis, former white supremacist and co-author of The Gift of Our Wounds, right after these messages.
Here's some great news. If you missed the deadline to sign up for a healthcare plan, or more importantly, if you signed up for a plan that you're just not happy with, you still have a choice. It's called Medishare. Medishare is a Christian healthcare sharing program. It's been around for 25 years. They have hundreds of thousands of members all across the country. And get this, over the years, Medishare members have shared more than $2.5 billion of each other's medical bills. Best of all, you could save a lot of money with Medishare. The typical savings for a family is about $500 a month. Your savings may be less or more, but think about what you could do with that extra money every month. So if you think you're stuck with a high-cost health plan that doesn't have much to offer, think again. You can join Medishare anytime, so call them today and check it out. Here's the number to find out more. There's no pressure. They're super easy to talk to. Just hit *345. That's *345. *345.
Hello, this is Bishop Harry Jackson of Hope Christian Church in Beltsville, Maryland. Jesus said you would do greater works than he did. When the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way to Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here. The Lord has sent me to Bethel." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you." If we'll go emotionally and spiritually where they went physically, we'll come into the truths and the transforming and transferring of the mantle that happened with Elisha will happen with us in our generation. Elijah was the old school generation. He was the 84, 85-year-old, nearly 90-year-old, who has been the Billy Graham of the generation. And he says, I've walked with you, I've talked with you, I've told you, I've helped you, I've instructed you. Now, son, it's your turn. This is about passing the baton generationally. Some of us who are my age have to recognize that the 80-some-year-olds are all rolling off the scene, and whether we think ourselves to be young, small in our own sight, we're going to have to step up and be the only spiritual fathers that this generation can know. Join us this Sunday morning at 6251 Avondale Road in Beltsville or on the web at thehopeconnection.org.
Welcome back to Stacy on the Right on Urban Family Talk.
Hey, hey, hey. It's such a pleasure to be with you. Happy hump day. And what a guest we have for you right now. I'm so excited. It's my pleasure to welcome Arno Michaelis to the program, former white supremacist and co-author of The Gift of Our Wounds. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure, Stacy, and good job nailing the pronunciation of my name.
Oh, I kind of flubbed it a little bit earlier, and I'm like, I'm getting this right when he comes on. I'm totally getting this right. So thank you.
Most people don't. So
yeah, I want to get it right because well, first of all, nice last name. That's unique. I don't think I've ever seen that before.
In my case, it's Prussian.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's okay. First of all, The Gift of Our Wounds. Why did you write that book? And then we'll get into kind of the underlying stuff there.
Yeah, absolutely. The Gift of Our Wounds was written by myself and a man, Pardeep Singh Kalika. Pardeep lost his father, Satwan Singh Kalika, in the August 5th, 2012 Sikh temple shooting where a white supremacist gunman murdered his dad and 5 other people. And it was after that Pardeep reached out to me, really in an attempt to understand how someone could do that, but also to hopefully find some accountability, which, seeing as the gunman was a member of the gang that I had helped to start, I definitely did then, as I do now, feel a sense of responsibility for that violence, and it's important to me to offer accountability to survivors like Pardeep and to really anyone who's been the victim of hate crimes or any kind of violence, and hopefully be part of their healing process. So the idea of the gift of our wounds is actually really deep and resounding with so many people. Pardeep's a trauma therapist now, and when he's seeing patients, kind of before or after the actual therapy, they're small talking a little bit, and his patient will be like, "Oh, what are you doing?" And Pardeep's like, "Yeah, I just wrote a book called The Gift of Our Wounds." And for people who are going through challenges, just hearing that title, hearing that phrase makes them, light bulbs kind of go off, and they can sometimes see an entirely different perspective on their challenges and their struggles that they're going through. So the main reason we wrote that book is for anyone who's going through any kind of struggle in their life. We believe after reading it, they can get a different perspective on the struggle they're going through and really believe that they can reach a point where they'll not only survive that struggle, but they'll be able to look back on it and say, I'm glad that I went through that because it made me a better person. And ideally, if it can bring them to a point where they can help other people through their struggles also, that's a really beautiful thing.
Yeah. So I'm on the Amazon page, and it's the entire title is The Gift of Our Wounds: A Sikh and a Former White Supremacist Find Forgiveness After Hate. It's hardcover. It lists you and, of course, Pardeep as the authors. And the blurb is the powerful story of a friendship between 2 men, one Sikh and one skinhead, that resulted in an outpouring of love and a mission to fight against hate. So one of the things that pops into my mind as I'm talking to you, and you are a former white supremacist, is I'm like dying to know what made you a white supremacist in the first place. Why did you feel the need to be a white supremacist?
That's a great question. The very simple answer is suffering. And it's important to qualify that by saying that I had an idyllic childhood compared to most children on the face of this earth. I grew up in a nice house in a nice neighborhood. My parents were together. They both loved me very much, as did all the adults in my life. Everybody was just gushing over me about how gifted I was and what a genius I was and how I was so special and wonderful. But I grew up in an alcoholic household, and that really damaged my parents' relationship. My dad is the one stricken with that disease, and my dad's an amazing person. He's my hero, and he's always been a huge supporter of me, what I'm doing now. And despite the challenges he went through in my childhood, even back then, he always let me know he loved me, and that was always crystal clear. But his disease made life really difficult for my mom at times, and she was suffering, and I could sense her misery as a kid. And that's when I started lashing out at other kids. Looking back, like everything I do now is all storytelling, and it's kind of Monday morning psychoanalysis. So I gather from my looking at my childhood that while everybody's telling me how wonderful I was because I was suffering, I was like, no, I'm not wonderful. Actually, I'm horrible. And if you don't believe me, watch what I'm going to do to this kid. And so I started out as a bully on the school bus as early as kindergarten. I started to get like kind of a stimulation from lashing out and causing problems, especially when I could get adults to be like tearing their hair out about my behavior. And I got a thrill from that. I got a sense of power from that. Other kids were afraid of me. And as I grew older, I needed to keep feeding this habit like any other kind of addiction. And like substance abuse, what gets you high the first time, like 10 times later, does not. So you have to keep escalating the substance. And in my case, my substance was antisocial behavior. So I went from being a bully on the school bus to fights in the schoolyard, to fights in the street, breaking and entering, vandalism, burglary. By the time I was 14, I started drinking myself. The first time I drank till I passed out, and I drank like that for another 20 years. By the time I was 16, I was very acclimated to violence. I had been violent since I was a little kid. It was second nature to me. And I saw hate as just like another part of the thrill. Like I got a thrill from saying, not only I hate you to like principals and teachers, but like I hate the cops and I hate the government and I hate this society and I hate everything. And that's who I was when I heard white power skinhead music, which was, I was already into punk, which I still love. I never want to make it sound like punk is some kind of gateway drug to becoming a white power skinhead. But to me, punk was just about breaking things and like raw aggression and fury. And this white power skinhead music I heard had that same musical style, but the lyrics were all about blood and soil and race and nation, like all of the exact same themes that Adolf Hitler used to corrupt the minds of so many Germans to the point of mass murder back in the 30s and 40s. And I wasn't ignorant of that. I knew where this stuff came from, but I didn't care. All I cared was that it made people angry, it repulsed people, and it gave me this thrill of like being part of this like forbidden rebellion that society, us against the world kind of vibe. And as friends and I started a white power skinhead gang of our own, and I had been in punk bands screaming stuff for a couple of years already, so we started our own white power skinhead band, and it was like a magnet for disgruntled white kids. They just like flocked to us, and we scooped them all up, and our gang grew. And as we radiated hostility out to the world being the system that it is, reflected the hostility back to us in no uncertain terms, oftentimes in multiples. So within 6 months, my best friend who was in my band and who I started the gang with went to prison for shooting a kid that came to do a drive-by in our house. Within a couple of years, another very close friend of mine was shot and killed in a street fight as he was out practicing hate and violence as I had taught him to do. And as these horrible things happen to us because of our actions, according to the ideology that we're buying into, rather than like, pause and be like, oh, whoa, what are we doing? We saw all these bad things happening as validation of the paranoia of the us versus them narrative, and we just kind of spiraled further into it, and I went on like that for 7 years.
Wow. So you've completely explained that this is coming out of a place of hurt for you, and your reaction to the hurt was to become, hurtful to other people. And then you got the idea for the white supremacy part of it from music that you listened to. And then you allowed that to be kind of the seed that blossomed into this huge kind of horrible, but very deliberate action that you took in forming a gang and kind of gathering people together so that they could commiserate on all of their misery and then kind of direct that outwards. So what made you stop? Like because what you're describing to me sounds so all encompassing and so complete. You know, when you have this idea in your mind and then it's completely validated and then you gather together with a bunch of other people who believe the same thing, even when there's wrong coming from it, the deaths of your friends, your mind is not changed by that. It just kind of reinforces the idea that everyone's against you and specifically certain groups of people are to blame for what you're experiencing. So how do you come out of that place to where you are now?
That's a great summary of it. And it's important to understand that any kind of fundamentalist ideology, whether it's political or religious or racial or whatever, you have to exist in this state of siege. You have to have a sense of oppression that drives your thoughts and your actions, and whether or not that oppression is validated by the rest of society doesn't matter. In fact, if the rest of society does not validate the oppression, it's even better. And what we did to get kids involved is we would find out what's wrong in their life. So if a white kid, 16-year-old, doesn't have a girlfriend, I'm going to tell them that that's because this is the late 80s. So back in that time, I would say, well, it's because the Jews are putting Michael Jordan on TV and all over these billboards, and they're trying to convince white men that Michael Jordan's the ideal man, and that's why these girls don't like you. Like, never mind you don't take a shower and you don't go to school and you don't do anything to better yourself. Like, it's way easier to blame someone else. And when that happens, you get in this kind of death spiral that can lead to atrocities like the Sikh temple shooting that happened August 5th, 2012. In my case, I was incredibly fortunate that there was a sense of exhaustion, like from day one when I got involved in these gangs. I was already tired. Like, being hateful and violent, it sucks the life out of you, and it had been sucking the life out of me for 16 years already. So from day one, I'm tired. From day one, I'm exhausted. But just like a heroin junkie who's utterly exhausted by the drug, they don't care. They just want more heroin. And they know it sucks. They know it's a miserable way to live, but they don't care about that. All they want is the thrill. And so that's kind of how I dealt with the exhaustion at first. But the exhaustion came from all these different angles, one of them being that I knew what I was doing was wrong. There were times early on even where as I was hitting somebody or as I'm kicking somebody, I have a voice inside me saying, like, what is wrong with you? Why are you doing this? You're a horrible person for doing this. And I didn't have the courage to even acknowledge that voice, much less answer it. But the voice didn't go away. So I had to constantly expend energy to kind of drown that out, like a little kid putting their fingers in the ears going, nah.
Right.
to have some kind of distraction. Well, my distraction was alcohol, which is never an excuse. The white power music, surrounding myself with angry white kids, the rhetoric, the violence itself. So that whole process was exhausting. What was also exhausting was cutting myself off from the rest of society, particularly media and culture that I had once enjoyed. I'm a lifelong film, TV, music geek, and as a white power skinhead or any alt-right or white neo-Nazis, anybody in that whole genre, and this bears true for Islamist groups or any kind of political extremists also, you cannot take in any information that doesn't affirm your ideology. So anything on TV was Jewish propaganda to destroy our minds as good Aryan white men. Anything out of Hollywood was. Any music that wasn't our music was. And I grew up loving this stuff, loving Hollywood movies. I couldn't watch Blade Runner. I couldn't watch Seinfeld on TV. I couldn't root for the Green Bay Packers, which I did all those things anyway. And while I did them, I had this ridiculous shame for enjoying them.
Wait, so because there were black people on there, or is it because Seinfeld had Jewish cast and the football team had?
It's the as you can imagine, white power types have a very long list of people that they hate, and black people are pretty high up on that list. But at the top of the list Probably number 2 would be Jews, and number 1 is the white race traitor. Like a white person who is not racist is your greatest enemy. And everything on TV was seen as, because Seinfeld, obviously, like everybody on that show is Jewish, and it's the genius of Jewish humor that makes it so funny and has made it such a hit. And to this day, I still watch it almost daily, and it still brings me joy. But back then, I couldn't do that, and I felt like an idiot because of it. And it really made my anti-Semitism seem as stupid as it was. And watching the Packers, any NFL football team is a bunch of black guys, a bunch of white guys, and they not only have to get along, they have to, like, function as a well-oiled machine. They have to care about each other. They have to, like, think the same way if they want to win a football game. So that's not very conducive to the whole white power narrative either. So that was a huge source of exhaustion. But what was most exhausting was when people I claimed to hate treated me with kindness. And I was very fortunate that over and over again, throughout the 7-year period I was involved in hate groups, there were people like a Jewish boss, a lesbian supervisor, black and Latino coworkers who refused to capitulate to my hostility. So everything I did back then was meant to provoke hostility. It was meant to get people to hate. And if they hated me, it was all the better. So when people would respond to my hostility by wanting to fight me or cursing me out, like, they were literally putty in my hand. But these brave people who treated me with kindness refused to capitulate to my actions, and instead they took control of those interactions. And they said, I'm not going to let you dictate the terms of engagement. I'm going to dictate them, and the rules are, this is how human beings should treat each other.
All right, we've got the music playing, and so I want to ask you to hold over if you can, if you have time.
Sure.
Okay, perfect. So we'll continue our time with Arno Michaelis right after these messages. Stay there, everybody. This is Just a Minute with Stacey Washington. As if college students aren't already totally triggered, George Washington University hosted a workshop for students and faculty on the unmerited perks and favors showered upon white Christians, which are unavailable to everyone else. The Multicultural Student Services Center wants to teach minority students they are dupes. Meaningless buzzwords like ally, unconscious bias, and microaggression were employed for this purpose. The Bible is very clear that we are indeed privileged to be the beneficiaries of Jesus Christ's great work on the cross. We are also called to suffer with him, which is a privilege. Christianity is open to everyone, period. Wouldn't it be great if GWU got out of the business of oppressor talk and back to teaching higher ed? Because that is what the parents of those students are paying tuition for. I'm Stacey Washington. Find out more at StaceyOnTheRight.com.
Hi, I'm Jerry. I always had to have the expensive clothes and sell the right drugs. But drugs and alcohol eventually broke me. So I came to Teen Challenge. And now I've been drug-free for 10 months.
If you know an adult or teenager who's struggling with a chemical addiction, Teen Challenge can help. Call us today at 417-581-2181 or reach us online at teenchallengeusa.com. This is Urban Family Talk.
Abraham Hamilton III.
God put us in this world at this time to be salt and light. We don't fold because of the darkness that we're facing. This is not the first time in the world's history that it's gotten dark. God has called you and I to be his ambassadors, even in this dark moment.
Tune in to the Hamilton Quarter, weekdays at 5 p.m. Central on Urban Family Talk.
Hi, this is Steve Tiber with 8 Days of Hope. We've seen God open up so many doors for us to help serve and love those who get affected by a natural disaster.
As the trees and the wind started crashing down around us, my wife was, of course, very diligently praying, Lord, please be with us.
Very simply, we do it because God commands us to love others.
I see these volunteers all as
a gift from God.
And I'm just grateful they're here, helping out. It's a blessing.
If you're interested in becoming a part of what God's doing through 8 Days of Hope, please go to 8daysofhope.com, click on Get Involved, submit your email address.
I've noticed that whenever there's a time in my life when things might be a little gloomy, the number one thing that I can do is to go serve somebody.
And I would encourage anyone else to, it's worth it. Come out and do it next time if you didn't make it to this one, and the Father will really bless you in it.
Thank you so much for your prayers and volunteering with 8 Days of Hope.
Welcome back to Stacy on the Right.
Hey everybody, thanks for being here. I'm riveted by the words of our current guest. We have Arno Michaelis here. He's a former white supremacist and co-author of The Gift of Our Wounds. And we're just hearing how people loved him out of his state of mind, where he had a voice inside that was saying, this isn't right. But in order to come out of it fully, he needed people who refused to accept his paradigm of hate. Instead, they showed him love and respect and proper treatment. So Arno, let's unpack this a little bit more, because this is the antithesis of what we're taught to do. We're taught to strike back, punch harder than we get punched. If someone does something to you, you take them to the authorities, you string them up, do whatever you can to get back at people who mistreat you. And you had a lot of, you had these forces that had kind of hemmed you in, with starting with your pain, and then you're hemmed in with, this is who I am. I'm a white supremacist, and I don't like these kinds of people, and that means I can't enjoy a lot of things I used to, but it's worth it because I'm right. And then you encounter people at your workplace who you have to work with them because you need to work, and they're treating you with kindness. And so was it like a pile-on, or was it over time? How long did it take you to kind of say, I'm done with this?
Well, that's a beautiful summary of it, Stacey. I really appreciate that. It's the best way to look at it, and Pardeep and I do a lot of professional development with educators as well as with businesses, and especially with educators, we want to get across the truth of cultivation, which is essentially that every action of ours plants a seed, and when you're dealing with people who are suffering and people who've been through trauma, more often than not, you're not going to see any results from that seed being planted. All these people who treated me with kindness, as far as they were concerned, it probably looked like they were just talking to a wall. It probably looked like it wasn't having any effect on me. There were honestly times when people were treating me with kindness, and I literally ran away because it was so disconcerting to me. Like, I'm trying to hate black people, and this sweet old lady is being very nice to me. Like, this is messing up my whole program. And I would flee. I would get out of there as fast as I could, and I'd go home to my dingy apartment where I lived with a bunch of other drunk skinheads, and I'd get wasted, and I'd go out in the streets, and I'd pick a fight with the first person I could find, like trying to put as much distance between myself and this singularity of humanity that I just experienced. But the human psyche does not work in terms of subtraction. Once something happens to us, it is part of who we are from that day forward. It can't be erased. It can't be taken out. And despite my best efforts to tear these seeds out of who I was, and I tried every single day as hard as I could, they took root and they grew to leave less and less room in my heart for the kind of hatred necessary to hurt people, and importantly, to hate myself, which I certainly did throughout this entire process. I tried to kill myself twice by slitting my wrist. Both times my life was saved by my skinhead girlfriends, two different ones, who stopped the bleeding and called ambulances. And it could certainly be argued that my entire 7 years in hate groups, if not my entire 20 years of heavy drinking, was an ongoing suicide attempt also. Those seeds that were planted, ultimately, they could not do anything but come to fruition. And so after 7 years, those seeds had produced exhaustion to the point where I'm looking for an excuse to get out. And that happened in like a two-stage process. In 1994, my girlfriend and I broke up, and I became a single parent to my 18-month-old daughter. So go figure, but hate and violence and alcohol is not a recipe for a healthy relationship between a man and a woman. And a couple months after I became a single parent, a second friend of mine was murdered in a street fight. And by that time, I had lost count of how many of my friends had been incarcerated. And it finally hit me that if I didn't change my ways, death or prison was going to take me from my daughter. So that was my moment to walk away. But I honestly believe that had everything else not been in place, had those acts of kindness not happened, had Seinfeld not aired, had I not been a Green Bay Packer fan, had my parents not given up on me, or had my parents given up on me and instead of sticking with me like they did, if any of those things were out of place, that second murder could have driven me further into the movement rather than out of it. So nowadays, every single day of my life, I spend a good part of that day in gratitude that I'm no longer that person, and definitely in gratitude for all the people in my life who helped to divert me to a better path.
Wow. So I'm please don't feel pressured by this question, but this is Christian radio, and I'm wondering if sure. There was a faith component at all, to the conversion that you experienced, because you talk about gratitude and love, and that there were these inextricable pieces that you had that happened, like Seinfeld, the TV show. When I think of it, I don't think of what you just described. I mean, I enjoyed it a lot when it was on, but it wasn't that's not one of the TV shows I consider to be momentous for me personally. There are a couple, but not Seinfeld. But for you, it really made a difference. Was there a faith component at all? Did you have any Christian friends or anyone who was a Christian who stepped in as well?
Well, I should begin this answer by saying that I'm a Buddhist. I've taken a refuge vow. My Tibetan refuge name is Nejung Chosum. It means renunciation Dharma bridge. I meditate daily, and for me, my spiritual jam all comes from the Dharma, which is the teaching of the Buddha. But I love Christianity. I love the teachings of Jesus Christ. I love doing talks in churches, which I do a ton. And the first talk I ever did in a church, which you can find on my YouTube channel, My Life After Hate, creatively entitled Me and Jesus, I talked about how throughout my entire life I was literally like Antichrist for one reason or another, from like every possible angle you could imagine. And it wasn't until I started meditating and studying Dharma that I had this epiphany where one day I'm reading the teachings of the Buddha, and I just kind of like leap up, and I'm like, oh, if everyone was a Buddhist, there'd be world peace. And I wanted to like grab people by the collar and be like, have you heard the good news about the Dharma? And then I kind of checked myself, and I'm like, wait, who do I sound like now? And I recalled all the times where I would kind of poo-poo Christians who would come at me like that, and it hit me then that if a human being finds the embodiment of love and forgiveness in the teachings of Jesus Christ, there's nothing more beautiful than that. It's no, to me, it's no more or less beautiful than me finding those same qualities in the Dharma, or Pardeep finding it in Sikhi, or my Muslim friends finding it in the Quran, or my Jewish friends finding it in the Torah and the Talmud. It's to me, human spirituality engages you with what's best about our human experience, which to me are love, forgiveness, courage, wisdom, compassion, kindness, like those things that make life such a wonderful experience. And to wrap it up, I would say faith is absolutely crucial every single day, because it's so much easier to look for reasons to be discouraged and look for reasons to be outraged, and our society is like this big outrage machine right now, from all directions, from all political poles. Everybody's outraged about something, and it's very easy to fall into that mode. I'm as susceptible to it as anybody else, but when you have faith that our existence is a basically primally good process, and that underneath all this stuff that's happening, that goodness is always there, then you have the power to shape the reality that you live in. And that's something that I work on every day. And for people who find the ability to do that through the teachings of Jesus Christ, through the Bible, through fellowship in church, like, more power to them. They're my heroes. Thank
you for that. I wanted to kind of understand what kind of faith tradition that you were coming out of with a history like that. I also want to thank you for writing the book and for joining us today. It's been really, it's a fascinating conversation because I can honestly say you're the first person I've ever spoken to who used to be a white supremacist, and to be able to have this conversation, it's been really, it's been a real privilege to get to talk to you and to hear more about the book. I put the link in on the live streams, and you can find it on the Facebook page for the listeners who want to read or get the Audible download. It's on Amazon, so easy to access. And I wish you the best with all of the speaking and spreading the message that we can actually really plant seeds when we encounter people who are sucked into this kind of hate, that they're not lost causes. They can come out of it, and we can help with that by being kind. Arno Michaelis, former white supremacist and co-author of The Gift of Our Wounds. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Stacey. I really appreciate your insight and your voice as well.
Thank you. It's been great to talk to you. So yeah, good to talk to you. So we have a few minutes left in the show. And I would, I plan to add him to my prayer jar to pray that, because I hear the joy in his voice when he talks about being a Buddhist, but I would love it if he knew the joy of Jesus Christ, which is ultimately better. And it's the truth. So it's fascinating to get to hear him describing the pain that he underwent, the things that started him on the path to white supremacy, and how the resultant actions of others, both the negative actions that they took, that they were arrested, they were killed, they were, and taken from him, their friendship was removed through different horrible circumstances, that those were really the kind of turning of the corner for him. And then it was coworkers and people who they refused to treat him in kind. They turned the other cheek, and they were kind to him, and they were loving towards him, and that those were the things that really made a difference in him coming out of that lifestyle. It's a lesson for us all. We all have the tendency to want to strike back and to defend ourselves. And, I'm a big believer in the Second Amendment and defending yourself. So that's not what I'm referring to here. I'm talking about in the verbal arena and in, when you're working with someone and they're difficult to work with, or you're living with someone and they're difficult to live with, or they're your relative and they can't give you what you need. I'm sure everyone has a situation in their family where there's a family member who the role that they're supposed to play is not the role that they play. And you desperately want them to play that role and to fulfill your need for that person in your life, and they refuse to. I have that situation in my immediate family, not my husband and my kids, but the next level up from that. And it is a difficult place to be, to every day be looking for this behavior and this activity from a person, and they won't give it to you. And so the reaction is you want to strike back, you want to fight back, you want to kind of orchestrate the situation. But it sounds to me like if we can take anything away from the Arno Michaelis interview, it's that when we're kind and when we do not respond to the evil behavior of others in the same way, that we can make the biggest difference. So I definitely think this was a worthwhile interview, and I'm so glad he was able to come on the show. So we have a little bit of audio from Kellyanne Conway that I want to end the show with. She's talking about Jim Acosta and his shouted questions of really unprofessional behavior at the Singapore summit. He just was so uncouth. And so she had something to say about it. It's number 4.
Kellyanne, this headline will get your attention and make you click on it if you're online. This is from the Daily Wire. Watch. CNN's Jim Acosta interrupts historic signing ceremony, shouts at Trump. That was their headline. If you click on it, this is the video you see.
Mr. President, did he agree to indeed nuclearize, sir?
We're starting that process very quickly. Very, very quickly. Absolutely.
Did you talk about auto-warm beer, sir?
So there are some critics, Kellyanne, saying that he was choosing the wrong moment, a historic moment, to throw out questions to the president. And then the 2020 campaign manager for President Trump, Brad Parscale, who's been on our show before, he's now calling for Acosta to lose his press credentials. He thought it was inappropriate. What are your thoughts, and what are the president's thoughts?
Well, some people in the White House press corps do that routinely. They want to make things about them. I'm not naming any names because why give it oxygen, but they certainly want to make it about me, myself, and I. On Twitter, they're all a hot mess in the kind of snark and bark towards this president and those who work for him, including here at the White House, in the cabinet, and elsewhere, things that would not pass editorial muster in a newspaper. I call it social media muscle, cable news cojones. Many of them demonstrate that, but don't have the courage.
Yeah. It's a lack of self-control. And it's pretty horrible to watch. It's even more horrible to experience it firsthand. And I felt like it was one of the low points of the summit, because Jim Acosta yelled questions at Kim Jong-un, and we were trying to put our best foot forward. So anyway, that's the show for today. God bless you. I hope you guys have a wonderful evening. I'm actually back on the radio in 1 hour, filling in for Abraham Hamilton III on the Hamilton Corner on American Family Radio. Tune into that, and I'll be back with you tomorrow.